Yeah, the AV valves are still closed. So blood can't flow into the ventricles just yet. They will eventually, but not at this point. So that's why we have relaxation of the ventricles, but we don't have a change in volume. And so eventually what will happen is, you'll get back to this first point where the valves will open up, and then you'll get filling of the ventricles. So let's review this. So you start in the late ventricular dystole, where the atria and the ventricles are filling up with blood passively. Then the atria contract, atrial systole, that pushes more blood into the ventricles. The valves will then close with the first sound, and this begins ventricular systole, where you first have isovolumic ventricular contraction, where pressure is building up, but the volume is not changing in the ventricles. Then those semilunar valves will open up, and then you get ventricular ejection, where the blood will shoot out the pulmonary trunk and aorta. And that eventually will come close as those semilunar valves close, creating that second sound. And then you enter isovolumic ventricular relaxation, where you get where the heart is fully relaxed, the ventricles and the atria, but you only have filling of the atria, and eventually that will lead to filling of the ventricles, and that starts the process all over again. So the trick here is learning, not only learning each of these steps here, but then to keep track of what's in systole, what's in diastole at any given time. That's the real trick, keeping track of what's being contracted, what volumes are changing, what pressures are changing. And this is really important, not only just for the physiology of it, but also for medical reasons too. So there's a lot of analysis built around looking at volume and looking at pressures through a cardiac cycle here. And so people have made this fancy graph called the pressure volume loop. And so here on the bottom axis we have the left ventricle volume in milliliters. So we're just looking at the left ventricle. We're not looking at any other volume of any other chamber, just the left ventricle. And then we have the pressure of the left ventricle as well. This is millimeters of mercury. Now, why are we obsessed with the left ventricle? Because it's the guy that really pumps, it's the chamber that really pumps the systemic circuit though. The circuit that goes to everything else in your body. So it's really important to understand and to evaluate. And so here we start at point A. And so the first part, remember, is ventricular diastole. It's the relaxation of the heart. We're just having an increase in volume as blood is flowing in, right? But at this point we have not added any pressure because we're still in diastole. Then from A prime to B, we have atrial systole. So the extra 20% of blood volume gets pumped in there. And at this point, at the end of this point at B, we have something called EDV. That's the end diastolic volume. So this is the end of what we call ventricular diastole. And at the very end, whatever that volume is, we call that end diastolic volume. That's a pretty important parameter in heart physiology and exercise physiology. This is end diastolic volume. We also often call this the preload.
So that's the amount of blood that's going to be sent to.
That's the amount of blood in the ventricle before the ventricle contracts. And so then we have the ventricular contraction that takes us from B to C. And remember, this is isovolumic systole contraction. So we have an increase in pressure. We have an increase in pressure, but not a change in volume. If you had a change of volume, it would either go this way or it would go this way, right? Right, because of the x-axis is the volume. But we're just going straight up, meaning we don't change the volume, but we're changing the pressure here. So pressure's going up, and then we have ventricular ejection where the valves open up, and then we have this huge arc here that takes us to D. And that will be the end of systole. After we get to D, we're at the end of systole. That's why we call it ESV, the end systolic volume here. And then we do isovolumic relaxation. That's this big drop here. Keep in mind it's a vertical line. That means we're not changing volume, but we're changing pressure here. And that brings us back to A. So we went through all the same steps here, but it's just one big loop here. Alright. And a third way to look at this, I'm not going to go over this in as much detail, but this is called Wigger's diagram. If you're ever interested in any field in cardiology, you'll be very familiar with a Wigger's diagram. This is a really cool diagram because it shows you everything that's going on. It shows you pressures, it shows you sounds, it shows you the ventricle volumes, and even shows you the ECG. And so what you can do is you can look for abnormalities in this, and you can make diagnoses from these. I just want to point out a couple quick things. You can notice that here, spot C, and this part B here line up with the lub and dub sounds. So hopefully from there you can tell me what's happening at point C and point B. You have the aortic pressure here too, and so hopefully that tells you something about what's happening in A and B as well. And lastly, you have your ECG here, and I just want you to see how your ECG lines up with the actual contractions. This is the P wave, right? What does P wave stand for? Depolarization of what? The atria, right? But look, this is the left atrial pressure right here. So you see there's a delay here. So this is the P wave. There's a delay before it actually happens, right? So there's depolarization and there's a delay before you see the actual contraction, and that should make sense, right? There are many steps between depolarization of the sarcolemma and the actual contraction, the actual cross-bridge cycling. So even though you have the ECG, that doesn't tell you the exact timing of the physical contractions. That just tells you when these cells are being depolarized. And you'll notice that here is the URS echocomplex, and here is really where there's a delay from here to here before you see ventricles actually building up pressure, and so on and so forth.
So the P wave is the contraction, but then the
P wave is a depolarization.
depolarization.
But these pressures are actually showing you the contractions. All right. So, we talked about what happens in a given cardiac cycle. We talked about how muscles contract. We talked about the cycle that occurs. Now we're going to talk about ways we can modify it. Oh, I'm almost out of time. So I'm going to just wrap up this slide real quickly. We talked about volumetric rate, how that's the important volume, right? So the volumetric rate of the circulatory system is cardiac output. So cardiac output, represented as CO, is basically the heart rate, represented as HI, times stroke volume. And the stroke volume is how much, kind of saw it here in the previous graph, is how much blood the ventricle is pushing out into the aorta. That volume of blood in milliliters is a stroke volume. And so next time, and I'm not going to start it right now, but next time we're going to talk about how we can modify heart rate and how we can modify stroke volume, because that's the ways you modify cardiac output. The body doesn't really care if you're increasing heart rate or increasing stroke volume. What they really care about is what the volumetric rate is. What is the cardiac output? Is it high? Is it low? What times would you want it to be high? When you want a lot of blood flowing? When you're active, when you're exercising, right? So when you exercise, your cardiac output should go up, right? And that's the main parameter that's being regulated here, is cardiac output. And so we'll talk more about that this coming Thursday. Remember, this Friday is your proposals. Turn in proposals for your podcast. So hopefully you've gotten papers. If you're so confused about it, come talk to me. But let's do this Friday.